So I usually like to start with a quote, and this is from George Arundel, who we'll hear more from later in the program. And he says, "As beautiful flowers are found in barren places, so is the most beautiful service that which is rendered in the times and places of the greatest need." So through the study of theosophy, we realize that we are an individual in appearance only. Our true nature is inherently intertwined with all others. In fact, all life is part of one universal and indivisible whole, as we learn in our theosophical talks. So how can we express our beliefs in a coherent and harmonious way that may benefit all those that we are inseparable from? All right, I'm just going to change the view a little bit here. Okay. How can we find life's purpose that is compatible with our values? How can we find practical implementation of our ideals in our daily lives? How can we work through community to elevate humankind? So these are the questions which have been expressed through the generations of seekers of light. As we experience our world, both directly and indirectly, we wish our lives in some way to benefit parts of humanity. At times, this is expressed somewhat wryly as an idealist, as wanting to, quote, save the world. My answer to that is yes, we do want to save the world, and it is in dire need of saving, isn't it? So we can have some minor and even major impact on parts of our societies, particularly if we act collectively. What is the world other than a collection of individuals? Oops, wrong way, sorry. So those that truly follow a course of selflessness and service are often unrecognized and unnoted. And most of you are familiar with Light on the Path, written down by Mabel Collins. And she writes, "And the power which the disciples shall covet is that which shall make them appear as nothing in the eyes of others." So recognition may or may not come with service, but if recognition is what is truly sought, then we are doomed to failure. The famous quotation that there is no limit to what a man can do who does not care who gains credit for it was written down by Charles Montague in 1906, but he was quoting a Jesuit priest from a previous century. But this sentiment has been expressed many ways in many different formats. So if we don't worry about getting credit or getting recognition, we are much freer to accomplish additional things. I'd like to include some quotes by Blavatsky, HPB, and she had written on daily life, "Theosophy should not represent merely a collection of moral verities, a bundle of metaphysical ethics epitomized in theoretical dissertations. Theosophy must be made practical," that's my emphasis, "and it has therefore to be disencumbered of useless digressions in the sense of desultory orations and fine talk. Let every theosophist only do his duty, that which he can and ought to do, and very soon the sum of human misery within and around the areas of every branch of your society will be found visibly diminished." I like this quote, and HPB was never one to mince words. She's very direct, saying theosophy, the high principles need to be made practical, or it really is just discussion and thought projects. So we find that each of us strives for meaningful work, whatever we choose as our vocation and hobbies and volunteer work. We want some meaningful work. This will generally be in service in some form to our brothers and sisters, even if it's indirect. But while our lives unfold, we hope to find ways to purify and expand our consciousness so that we may be better agents of divine intention. We struggle in our daily lives for basic physical necessities sometimes, certainly many do, substantive personal relationships, relevant vocations and methods to contribute to our community and our society at large. We have a plethora of choices every day Each choice leads to a different relative outcome. We can focus on our own development. We can attempt to follow the 10 commandments of Judaism and Christianity, the paramitas of Buddhism, the Yoga Sutras of Hinduism, the golden stairs of Theosophy, although of course imperfectly, none of us can do it absolutely. However, individual progress is not generally sufficient. We seek ways in which to contribute to the betterment of humankind. If we are alive, we must act. For even inaction is action. Karma is the path of action, and ultimately has the ability to lift the burden of humanity. Therefore, service, however we may define it, must include altruism as its basis. There are many examples of the philanthropist who wants recognition and influence and has mixed motives of helping others, and this is often counterproductive. Annie Besant, who's written on this topic extensively, in The Spiritual Life, she says, only by service this fullness of life is made possible. The whole of the universe is yoked to service of humankind. Every individual should pledge to service of humanity, past, present, and future. Humanity evolving up to the divine personage, eternal, immortal, indestructible. That should be the object of life, the goal of evolution. Very directly saying service is critical, central, absolutely necessary in order to elevate our development. So these high ideals, they sound wonderful, but they may not be attainable in the short term for most of us. However, our lives consist of many, many small steps, decisions, and they may have large consequences. If we can keep an eye on the ideal, then this can help motivate us and direct us in our day-to-day choices. Energy moves from our inward nature to our outer world. Because of this, it is not simply actions that matter, but the motivation behind them. We wish to bring some essential aspect of ourselves, our true being, into its most purified form, to the outer experiences in which we are involved. If our motives are selfish, no matter how beneficial the activity, we do not grow spiritually. Yet, the reverse is also true. If we are selfless, nearly any activity would likely be rooted in divine intention. Internal purification is therefore necessarily entwined with external performance. It's helpful to reflect intuitively on intention and choice. The appearance of service only is a hollow shadow of true service. If our motivation are pure, results are not essential. We need to work intelligently and be willing to learn from our mistakes. However, success is not always measured by outcome in a spiritual sense. So George Arundel, again, who gave us our opening quotation, he was the third international president of the TS. And he wrote a small inspirational instructional manual titled The Way of Service. He describes 3 principles of service in the theosophical sense. He writes that if you desire to be of service to others with advantage to them and without danger to yourself, see that these 3 principles guide you in your service. First, that your greatest joy is to tread the path of service. If we see it as an obligation, a burden, work, something we don't want to do, then the true benefit cannot be gained. Secondly, that you know yourself to be but the agent of some force greater than your own, which sends the power of service through you. And then thirdly, that you see in others the same divine nature you yourself possess. So if we realize we are on a path of service, this can be our greatest joy, and we are all on a path of service. We talk about the path of devotion, the path of knowledge. Yes, these are all essential, but no one is free from the path of service. You don't need to act entirely on your own account, but realize that you're a conduit of empathy and assistance. brought through divine forces. And we must be aware of the mutuality of service. We help each other. We are not the superior helping the inferior, or the stronger helping the weaker always. In certain situations we might be, but none of us is in a position forever. We may be the strong helper with some physical need now, but then in the future we may be weak due to illness, accident, aging. So we should never have the superiority of a helper, but just it's mutual. We should give help with empathy and compassion, not condescension and pity. We all need help at some point. Should it be physical, emotional, financial, mental, social, or spiritual? A former teacher of mine used to say, give the gift of receiving and receive the gift of giving. I always like that, because it doesn't mean you always have to be the giver. Give the gift of receiving and receive the gift of giving. Just think about that for a few moments. Those we help are not different from ourselves, but an extension of ourselves. When we believe this in our hearts, we are truly able to see the unified whole. As Ram Dass has written, we are truly walking each other home. He had a book he titled Walking Each Other Home, and I like the image. We're all on the path, development and evolution, and we're taking care of each other along the way. Dr. Keene, I.K. Keene, who many of you know, he's a well-known theosophical author from the 20th century. He wrote a book entitled Principles of Theosophical Work. It was very helpful and very inspiring. In the preface, he writes, the work of the Theosophical Society can be organized efficiently only when a large majority of its members, scattered throughout the world, understand clearly the aims of the society and the general principles which should guide them in planning and carrying out this work. So although much laudable work has been done every day throughout the world by individuals and organizations, both connected, some are theosophical, but many are not. Many have never heard of the principles of theosophy, but they provide care with compassion and caring, humility and honesty, generosity and genuineness. But a special opportunity is available for working with like-minded individuals through the vehicle of the Theosophical Society. Some believe that each member of the society has been specifically chosen for the contributions that they can make to the fulfillment of the mission of the society and the evolution of humanity. Members and friends can join together to promote these teachings to a world in terrible need of understanding our deeper nature and development. How might this manifest, and how can we as individuals contribute to the movement known as Theosophy? He writes later in the book, as this divine plan which we see working in the evolution of life and form everywhere is not a mere pious belief or a philosophical speculation, but as matter of fact, as the working of a modern factory, it naturally requires the services of a vast army of agents who are responsible for the working of its different parts and their successful completion. These agents are the hierarchies of angels and adepts who from the subtler planes guide the forces of nature and bring about those changes and adjustments in human institutions which are needed for the harmonious and efficient working of the plan. So he's saying not only do we need to do our own work and find out how to be of service, but we can work as agents of divine beings or work through them or in conjunction with them. As we become increasingly aware of unseen energies and entities, we can be of service in ways that may be less obvious. And as we go through other steps such as meditation and learning, knowledge, we can acquire ability to be more aware. As we become a center for peace and harmony, not only can we influence those we come into a daily contact with, but through openness and meditation, we can send healing thoughts and messages. So speaking about thought forms, Annie Besant has written a book by the name of Thought Forms, you may be familiar with, and she describes two effects of thought. Each definite thought produces a double effect, a radiating vibration in a floating form. The thought itself appears first to clairvoyant sight as a vibration in the mental body, and this may be either simple or complex. If the thought itself is absolutely simple, there is only one rate of vibration, and only one type of mental matter will be strongly affected. The mental body is composed of matter of several degrees of density, which we may commonly arrange in classes according to subplanes. And she goes on to talk about how complicated thought forms can be and how they can affect the mental body and also emotional and physical body of others. But the point here is that we're constantly creating thought forms that we're sending out into the universe. And if we can have them be positive, uplifting, healing, blessings, we can have a very helpful effect to those around us, either geographically or at distance. So beyond beyond individual blessings, we can access higher powers, which when channeled can have very dramatic effects. We can also send benevolent wishes to large groups of people with compassionate desire for healing and elevation. This is a dynamic and limitless resource. Jeffrey Hodson, who many of you are familiar with as well, in an article he wrote in 1933 for the Theosophists called Nature and the Gods, he writes more on this, and he says, those who serve by thought power and the evocation of superphysical energies, seeking to heal, to inspire, to uplift, to bless, to influence the mind of their fellows in the direction of brotherhood and peace, may greatly increase their effectiveness through cooperation with the gods. They bring to such work knowledge of the operation of natural forces, capacity to direct their flow, and freedom from the limitations of time and matter, and are therefore valuable allies in all altruistic work. So what he is describing here is that those who can align themselves with higher energies and transmit those energies through thought power and other elevated modalities can have enormous influence on others through their mental faculties and emotional natures. We must be careful not to interfere uninvited, of course, in specific situations, but by sending out positive and compassionate thoughts that are blissful and healing, we can send a general blessing and be free of judgment. Jeffrey Hodson continues, the power of individuals mentally to influence the thought, character, and conduct of others increases by geometric progression. We are taught, he's saying we are taught, when they think together in groups, the enormous potentiality for good of groups of dedicated and trained servants of the race who deliberately use their thought power for beneficent purposes at once becomes obvious. Organized efforts for these purposes could lead to the establishment of numerous extremely potent mind, quote, radio stations, unquote, or groups of trained thinkers. Mental work of incalculable value could be performed by such groups. I like that concept of focused radio stations. Jeffrey Hodson did this in New Zealand in the 1940s. He established a number of groups throughout the country. And they would meditate together, sending healing thoughts to various individuals and entities. How successful he was is impossible to know. But the unification of effort among individuals, and especially the divine alignment, can be of enormous power for good in the world. He writes about this in an article entitled Cooperation Between Angels and Men. And this is included in his collection of articles called Sharing the Light. We then turn to group work. This is useful in a variety of ways. As we recognize the unity of humanity, we realize how critical it is to be inclusive of others, co-pilgrims on this adventure of life. Most of us have various networks in which we operate on a day-to-day basis. We have family, friends of various origins, professional relationships with colleagues, social groups, avocational clusters, political affiliations, geographical connections, and other collections of acquaintances across the spectrum. Some of the relationships are purpose-driven, while others are simply for comradeship, leisure, and enjoyment. It is through interacting with other persons that we can learn about and improve ourselves. How then can we work in local groups to advance the vision of the Theosophical Society? There are many answers to this question, and it may vary by specific location and the makeup of each lodge and study center. This can be done by supplying education through teaching, deep reflection through meditation and similar practices, providing altruistic community services, and by opening opportunities for those that might not be aware of the TS, and by sharing its concepts and tenets. Dr. Timney recommends taking this one step further. Beyond study centers and lodges, he suggests creation of theosophical training centers for the specific purpose of training members for theosophical work. As he outlines it, the aims would be threefold. The first would be to provide systematic and graded teaching of theosophy for all workers and other members of the society who may wish to avail themselves to the faculties. Second is to provide systematic and graded teaching of different kinds for workers who want to do public work in accordance with theosophical ideals. And thirdly, to provide instruction and practical guidance on scientific lines for those who want to build a strong and pure character and to unfold their spiritual faculties with a view to become more efficient instruments in the working of the great plan. Imagine with me for a moment the potential of having tens of thousands of theosophical workers in the field, striving for the highest levels of service and ethics for the benefit of humankind. Extend this to the potential of hundreds of thousands or even millions of workers, all interconnected and holding the beliefs of unity, compassion, and fairness. The impact could be enormous on the affairs of people around the world, socially, politically, economically, and spiritually. In addition, consider the impact that could be made with harmonization of large numbers of members working on the higher planes. How can we find opportunities to be of service? This is the amazing part. You don't need to necessarily search for these, but they will come to you. They are often small or seemingly insignificant choices. But with each step, more opportunities open. We just need to be cognizant and able to recognize them. At some time in our development, we may need to reach out, but primarily they stare us in the face. There's the concept of intention. I just heard a Mitch Horowitz talk regarding the positive thinking movement and how intention can reshape our lives. In fact, I did a talk before the pandemic about creating major decisions and life changes. It was called Means, Motive, and Opportunities, the Keys to Change, and talked about the different pieces going into decision making and what their interrelationship was. Once we are open to certain possibilities, there is no end to opportunities. In Lucifer, the Theosophical Journal, it's written, Theosophy has to fight intolerance, prejudice, ignorance, and selfishness, hidden under the mantle of hypocrisy. It has to throw all the light it can from the torch of truth with which its servants are interested. It must do this without fear or hesitation, dreading neither reproof nor condemnation. So how can we even begin to fight intolerance, prejudice, ignorance, and selfishness? This is a challenge. We can begin by not indulging in these practices ourselves and setting a model for others who may be observing us. We can choose to do selfless actions when the opportunity arises, and we can support movements and organizations that reflect our ideals that may have more repercussions than we can achieve personally. Kindness can be infectious. Compassion can be contagious. Annie Besant, again writing in The Spiritual Life, says, our duty is to act, because without action, the world would not go on. It is our duty to act in the very spot where we are, because there lies the duty for which we have been born and which we should discharge perfectly. Annie Besant has written about this quite a bit, and she writes that when she was, an international president living in India, many people would write to her and say, I'd love to come to India. I'd love to be able to serve the masters. I would like to work for the International Theosophical Society. And she would always answer, no, that is not what you need. You need to act where you are in the setting you were born into. You were born in the circumstances you have now in order to serve in the way you can, to learn, to develop. The circumstances around you are created essentially for your own learning and development. Later in the same chapter, she writes, for only as we serve and love those around us will the eyes of the Spirit begin to open. Then we will recognize that there are helpers beyond, ready to help us as we help others. So it is through service that we can learn, and the eyes of the Spirit will begin to open. That's an appealing concept. So when we're willing to be selfless, then we gain the ability of understanding. This is reflected also in The Voice of the Silence. HPB has written, this is a famous passage that I really appreciate. HPB says, to reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child. Self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child. So how do we choose which opportunities for service to follow? This is the challenge to each of us. We must decide how to divide and apply our energies. We do have a duty to prevent cruelty and harmful action whenever we are able. We should contain our speech to messages that are kind, truthful, and helpful. HPB has suggested that there are many ways to serve our fellow beings, but none are higher than nourishing the soul through spiritual support and teaching. At times, we may choose how to help lift the burden of another. In other instances, we may be thrust into a situation of service, unbidden, at least to our conscious mind. So are there limits to service, and what would they be? The limits of service only in that we must do our own work and not that of another. We must do it fully and completely and with devoted attention. Annie Besant has written that it's doubly harmful to do the work of another. It interferes with our own work and distracts us from our focus. And it also deprives another of work that they should be doing, they should be undertaking. This should be kept in mind when we're choosing what work is ours. At one presentation, I had someone question, how do we know what work is ours? And I would say, that is the challenge of us. We have to choose, we have to pick and choose. And as we go through different stages of development, understanding, growth, we may choose differently. But when we know that something is within our purview and something that we wish to contribute, then the choice seems clear. So in summary, theosophical work can exhibit numerous facets. We can work individually as advocates for some human need. We can develop ourselves internally in order to purify our efforts, be compassionate and selfless in our attention. We can connect with the deeper aspects of our being and access hidden powers that can be a source of nourishment spiritually to ourselves and to those who struggle. We can work through our theosophical organizations to promote brotherhood and unity in all aspects of human endeavor. We can educate ourselves and others through examining comparative religion and theosophical principles. We can work in harmony with divine processes and perhaps divine beings. And we can understand unexplained laws of nature and use latent powers to implement beneficent interventions in the global community. It is with this knowledge we realize that any efforts to assist in bringing forth the divine plan are not wasted, but a true step forward in the pursuit of evolutionary progress that ultimately will manifest as significant elevations in health, relationship, and consciousness. I'm going to end with another quotation from George Arundel. He says, even a tiny flame shines brightly in surrounding darkness, so does a little act of service shines out clearly amidst surrounding selfishness. So thank you, and questions and comments, and I'll stop sharing the screen here so I can see.